My investigation team has seen, in all our years of service, such a level of violence against a defenceless person.
People know they are struggling, and yet nothing is done until there is a terrible tragedy.
Few homicide cases make sense, but some are even more hard to believe than most. These are Kiyran Earnshaw, 18 years old, and Luke Gaukroger, 15. You might think they can't be more than a couple of misguided teens. But in January 2020, these boys took someone's life with a samurai sword. Then, Luke wrote a rap song boasting about it. The detectives are pretty certain both would do it again if they weren't behind bars today. But who did they kill? And why did they target him? And what on earth went wrong for these two teens to end up like this? We'll explore these questions and many others in today's video. In the very last hours of January 16th, 2020, law enforcement from West Yorkshire called Elaine to come ASAP to her husband's workplace. 53-year-old Robert Wilson had just been pronounced dead, and yet Elaine was allowed to see him and hold his hand. However, the detectives advised that she didn't hold an open casket funeral. It would be too traumatizing for people to see him like this. Robert had 100 wounds made by a sword. His head was almost separated from his body. The process would have been complete, the detectives said, had they not arrested the two teens while they were still at it. Elaine could not believe her ears. Did they say teens? Elaine was never the same after that. She couldn't sleep at all, and she suffered severe panic attacks every day, which made it impossible for her to work. And in the end, she was hardly able to look after her children. And seeing her husband in that state was only the beginning. What followed was a gut-wrenching trial that revealed the full story, a story so senseless, outrageous, and downright tragic. West Yorkshire, a region ironically located in the middle of England, is known for delicious tea, the UK's largest maize, and Guy Fawkes. It's also the third unsafest metropolitan county in England. However, the Wilson family made nothing of this. They lived a perfectly safe and stable life away from the violence and troubling crews. Robert and Elaine Wilson lived in Huddersfield, where Robert worked at the pharmaceutical plant. Elaine had 2 children from a previous relationship, and Robert was happy to be a dad to them. The 4 of them were very close, and everyone who knew Robert knew his kindness and energy. He treated everyone with warmth and respect, and he always worked extra hard for those around him. When he wasn't at work or with his family, Robert spent time at the Dewsbury Golf Club with his friends group. On January 16, 2020, Elaine left Robert at the train station and kissed him goodbye as he left for work. He was going to work a late shift and take the train back home before the end of the day, but that was their last kiss. Around 11 p.m., the factory staff was getting ready to close for the night when a group of 6 intoxicated teens stumbled into the factory yard. They were looking for a good place to throw up, and somehow they decided the yard would be better than the street. Some of the workers noticed them, but they also noticed their age. All of them looked underage, harmless, they thought. They'd be gone in no time. However, the teenagers stuck around, making a ruckus. So someone played a warning over the speakerphone, asking them to leave the private grounds. The only girl in the group then told the boys to get going, and for a few seconds, they were all walking toward the exit. But then one of the boys said, "Wait, I forgot something." It was 15-year-old Luke Gaukroger. He had a knife on him, but he couldn't find it anymore. He figured he'd dropped it somewhere in the parking lot, so he went to look for it with his phone's flashlight. Meanwhile, another boy had started an argument with Robert Wilson. Robert was the factory supervisor, and he'd seen 18-year-old Kiyran Earnshaw lighting a cigarette in the plant's parking lot. Robert simply told Kiyran he couldn't do that, and that he had to put it out or take it elsewhere. Kiyran said no way. His mom worked at the same plant, and this was a public parking. How dare he tell him what to do? Now, Luke said he'd lost his phone too, so his other friends started looking for it with their phone flashlights. Robert's friend and co-worker John found Luke's phone on the floor. Its screen was smashed, and John decided not to pick it up, lest Luke blame him for the cracked screen. Eventually, Robert decided to call security and escort the rowdy gang outside. At that moment, Kiyran saw Robert holding his phone. Paranoid and intoxicated beyond reason, Kiyran assumed Robert was filming them, so he took out a 20-inch samurai sword from his pants. Wait, what? It was outrageous enough that a 15-year-old had a knife on him, but this one had a sword? A few minutes later, a local resident heard a scream so terrible, his blood froze. When the officers arrived, they found Luke and Kiyran climbed up over Robert's lifeless body, fighting over the sword. Luke was manically repeating, "Pass me the shank." The other teenagers had run away when it got ugly. Luke and Kiyran were arrested as they were trying to flee the scene. Kiyran was in such a frenzied state that when he was caught, he had to be tasered twice to be subdued. He was extremely drunk and high and was slurring his words. He kept asking the officers why he was being arrested. Yeah. He'd just taken a man's life with a samurai sword and he was wondering why he was being detained. He even complained of harassment as he was being taken to the station. Inside the detective's car, he banged his head on the cage repeatedly, and by the time he arrived at the station, he was snoring in a deep sleep. When an officer woke him up, they asked him what he had taken, and he simply replied, "Coke and Xanax." At the station, Kiyran was searched. That's when the police found he'd taken Luke's knife too, the small knife. The knife Luke was looking for that night, and perhaps the only reason why the group didn't leave the plant. Kiyran was looking for a fight that night. During Luke and Kieran's trial, Robert's autopsy report was read out loud. His neck, torso, head, jugular vein, liver, lungs, heart, spleen, and bowels were affected. And that's a light word. Describing everything he suffered that night would be way too graphic. Both Kiyran and Luke had extensive criminal records, including several charges for violent crimes. In October 2016, Kiyran took out a knife at a school and speared another student twice in the stomach. Kiyran was 14 at the time. On January 16, 2020, Kiyran had taken Xanax and white powder, and he'd glugged it all down with a shocking quantity of vodka. He and his group of delinquent tweens were equally intoxicated and violent. During the trial, something truly heartbreaking was revealed. Robert and his factory staff tried to help the boys find Luke's phone. Not only were they not aggressive to the teens, they were kind, just like everyone remembered Robert. Even worse than Robert's autopsy report was the CCTV footage capturing the entire event. It was played in court in front of Robert's devastated family. When the teens got rowdy and Kiyran began having an attitude, Robert called security. But before he could make the call, Kiyran accused him of filming them, and then he took out his samurai sword. He cussed at Robert, "F***ing videoing man and yeah?" He swung the sword at Robert, hitting him once. That's when his friend John intervened. Kiyran attacked John as well, almost severing his left hand. Panicking, John and the other factory worker on site, Mr. Thulis, ran away to call 999. This was a mere minute into the attack, but it was already too late. John was hiding some feet away from everything when he saw Kiyran grab Robert by the coat and pull him around the parking. Robert managed to escape Kieran's grip and started running away. Tragically, he couldn't run any more than a few feet before collapsing from his injuries. Kiyran then walked over to Robert and ridiculed him for collapsing. He then continued inflicting pain on him, destroying Robert's chance at survival. That's when Luke joined the scene and started shouting at Kiyran, desperate to join in on the action. Kiyran ignored him initially. He was in such a manic state that he didn't even notice his friend. Suddenly, Luke grabbed the sword from Kiyran and used it on Robert multiple times. When he was physically exhausted, he passed the sword back to Kiyran. The teens alternated between delivering gruesome blows, taking breaks from exhaustion, and robbing Robert. All the while, they were fighting over control of the sword. Just as he was attempting to do the most gruesome act yet, the officers arrived at the scene. To say Robert died in agony that night would be an understatement. CCTV footage played his cries ever louder and increasingly high-pitched. Then they got weaker, and his last words were, "I'll let you go, boys." Robert died a kind, helping man who didn't want any conflicts. After the trial was over, Elaine looked over at the killers and told them, "I want you to know you have taken the life of a much respected, admired, and good man." Some defendants show remorse or even start crying when they come to terms with the consequences of their actions. This happens particularly in cases where stomach-turning autopsy reports or CCTV footage are revealed. But Luke just stood there, poker-faced, every so often showing a slight smirk on his face. The night after unaliving Robert, Luke wrote this from his jail cell. "Dip him, leave him drippin', now my shoes floating in a pool. Burn my kicks, burn my Calvins after, burn that fool. Get round there tryin' to turn man ghost. Yeah, I'm tryin' to turn man to a ghost." 2 weeks later, 7 pieces of paper were found in his cell. This time, he'd even titled the song. It was called "No Remorse." Luke wanted everyone to know how he felt about what he had done. Sitting in the dock trying to show remorse, but I don't feel it and I can't even talk, can't. Chat out the judge like, "I'm sorry, I was too effed, didn't mean to catch a body. In all honesty, I wouldn't mean it though." Kiyran Earnshaw was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 22 years. Luke also received a life sentence, but as he was only 15 at the time of the attack, he gets the chance for parole after just 16 years. The judge told the 2 teens, "You ended his life, and you brought lifelong misery and grief to his wife, his 2 stepchildren, and his other family and friends. This frenzied and senseless attack on a man who was quite unable to defend himself went on for about 10 minutes. I have watched the recording, and it is truly a gruesome sight, made all the more ghastly by the fact that your blows and words, including your abuse of this dying man and his attempts to speak, were being recorded because he had begun a telephone call to the firm's security company." After the verdict, Elaine just said, "How on earth have we come to this? And why?" Her words echoed loudly in the courtroom. That was the question on everybody's mind. How can 2 people so young reach this level of evil? Whatever happened to them when they were young? From Luke and Kiyran's records, it's clear they have always had severe anger issues and a lack of empathy for others. Violent psychopaths emerge every now and then. Perhaps these 2 found one another, and this horrific match only led to increasingly worse acts. After the sentencing, DCI Mark Bowes from the homicide team said,
My investigation team has seen, in all our years of service, such a level of violence against a defenseless person.
Exactly. The senselessness of the attack, the fact that it was completely unprovoked, and that Robert was almost chosen randomly make this case especially heartbreaking. Kiyran was out to take a life that night. He found the lamest excuse. Even if Robert was filming him, so what? There is never a good excuse for offing someone. Meanwhile, Robert and John's families stuck together and wrote beautiful tributes for Robert. It is a comfort to us to know he will not be forgotten and that he made his mark in so many ways. He was a caring man who took the time to help out at a local nursing home and chat to the residents, raising a smile on their faces. Everyone has been left devastated by his death. We are just so glad that these youths are now off the street, as they obviously have no regard for anyone. To do what they did is completely incomprehensible to any normal human being, and they do not deserve a place in society.
Family of Mr. Wilson and Mr. Badejo and friends have shown nothing but courage, and I have nothing but admiration for the way in which they have helped themselves. I sincerely hope that today the sentences imposed bring some measure of comfort to the family, friends, and wider communities.
Kiyran eventually woke up, or at least he realized what he'd done was wrong, and Robert's family deserved an apology. So he wrote Elaine a letter saying January 16th was the worst night of his life, and ended the letter with, "I'm sorry." Luke, on the other hand, wrote another rap song. "Now I'm sitting in jail forgetting about all you. Next on the road, all of you think you're bad, but you ain't bad on your own. Step up in my zone. I'll show you I'm on that smoke." We can try and be the bigger person here, empathizing with whatever must have happened to Luke as a child to end up like this. But it's hard to forgive someone for doing something like this and continuing to be proud about it months later. In October 2022, Elaine began a lawsuit against Robert's factory bosses. She claims they put him in harm's way without proper training or security. It's the least she can do, as she is still struggling with this horror story. Hopefully she and her children can one day put this tragedy in the past. Hey, thanks for watching. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you know of other similar cases? Let me know in the comment section, and before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that bell button. See you next time.